I signed the papers without reading the fine print because I believed nothing important ever hides there, and for a long time that belief felt harmless. At the time, my life was quiet in the most ordinary way. I was 38, living alone in a rented apartment that I had memorized down to the cracks in the ceiling, working as an operations supervisor for a regional service company. It wasn't a bad job. It paid on time, the people were mostly decent, and every month I watched my savings grow just enough to convince myself I was moving forward. Still, I was tired. Not burned out in a dramatic way, just worn down by the feeling that every year looked exactly like the one before it. I didn't want to gamble or reinvent myself. I wanted something safe, something small, a step that felt responsible. When the opportunity came, that's exactly how it was presented to me. A modest service operation with predictable demand, steady numbers, and what everyone kept calling a standard setup. It wasn't pitched as a dream, just a sensible move for someone like me who had been careful his whole life. The meeting to sign the documents happened on a Tuesday afternoon, squeezed between my lunch break and a status call with my boss. The office was clean and quiet, the kind of place designed to make everything feel routine. The man across the table spoke calmly and never rushed his sentences, which somehow made the actual process feel faster. He slid the papers toward me in a neat stack and said, almost casually, that it was all boilerplate, nothing unusual, the same agreement everyone signs. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall more than once. I had 15 minutes before I needed to be back in my car, and I told myself I could skim later, that this was just the formal part of a decision I'd already thought through. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes caught familiar words and paragraphs that looked like every contract I had ever half-read before. I saw my name in the right places, numbers that matched what we had discussed, and initials marked with small yellow tabs. Each time I hesitated, the reassurance came gently, not as pressure, but as comfort. This is standard. This is how it's done. Everyone does it this way. I trusted that tone more than the text. In my head, I ran through the logic that made it feel reasonable. This wasn't my first agreement, I wasn't reckless, and nothing bad had ever happened to me from signing paperwork before. I told myself that if something were truly dangerous, it would be pointed out clearly, not buried in paragraphs that looked the same as all the others. I signed because I was tired of standing still, tired of overthinking, tired of believing that caution alone would eventually lead somewhere better. When I stood up to leave, there was no dramatic handshake or celebratory moment, just a polite smile and a comment about how smoothly everything went. Driving back to work, I felt a mild sense of relief, like I had finally checked an item off a long mental list. That evening, I cooked dinner, opened a beer, and let myself imagine a future that looked slightly lighter than the present. Nothing extravagant, just a little more control, a little more breathing room. Over the next few days, life went on exactly as before, which I took as proof that I had done nothing foolish. The documents went into a folder in my desk drawer, and I didn't feel the urge to open them again. I told myself that responsible adults don't obsess after the fact, that confidence means trusting your decisions. There was only one small thing that didn't quite sit right. A brief follow-up email arrived, thanking me for completing the process and reminding me to keep a copy of the agreement for my records, especially the attached schedule. I remember thinking it was odd that there was a separate attachment I didn't recall seeing, but I also remember telling myself that it was probably just a summary or a technical appendix. I marked the email as read and went back to work. At the time, it felt like nothing at all, just another administrative detail in a life full of them. Looking back now, that was the moment when something shifted, quietly and without announcement. The kind of shift you only recognize once it's far too late to do anything about it. For the first few months after I signed, nothing bad happened. In fact, everything worked almost exactly the way I'd hoped it would. My income stayed steady. The new operations settled into a predictable rhythm, and my days became comfortably repetitive. I'd wake up at the same time, make coffee, check emails, go to work, and handle the small decisions that filled the hours. There was no rush, no panic, no sense that I had made a mistake. If anything, I felt lighter. I wasn't richer in any dramatic sense, but I felt more balanced, like I had finally aligned effort with reward. I stopped checking my bank account every other day. I allowed myself a few small upgrades, a better chair for my apartment, a newer phone when the old one started acting up, dinners that didn't require checking prices first. Nothing reckless, just modest signs that I trusted my situation. That trust crept in slowly, almost invisibly. I stopped replaying the signing meeting in my head. I stopped thinking about the folder in my desk drawer. The idea that I might have missed something felt unnecessary, almost paranoid, and I had spent too many years being overly cautious to want to return to that mindset. Every time a friend asked how things were going, I answered honestly, fine, steady, no surprises. That word, steady, became important to me. It meant I had chosen correctly. It meant the long stretch of careful living had finally paid off. The paperwork faded into the background, replaced by routines and habits that felt reassuring. Of course, there were small details that didn't quite match my expectations, but they were easy to explain away. The first was a service fee that appeared on a monthly statement, an amount small enough to be annoying but not alarming. I assumed it was something I had overlooked in the setup costs, one of those charges that always exists but no one mentions because it's considered normal. The next month, there was another line item with a similar feel, administrative adjustment, processing charge, something vague and impersonal. I told myself that these were the kinds of things people complain about online but learn to live with in real life. Every system has friction, every agreement has fine points. The important thing was that the core numbers still worked. Around that time, I started receiving more automated emails. Most of them were harmless reminders or generic updates, but a few had wording that made me pause. Phrases like, per the agreed structure, or as outlined in the schedule, showed up more often than I expected. I noticed that some of the rules felt rigid in ways I hadn't anticipated. Deadlines that couldn't be moved, processes that had no flexibility even when circumstances changed slightly. Still, none of it rose to the level of a problem. It was just firm. I told myself that structure was the price of stability, that predictability required clear boundaries. Emotionally, I relaxed more than I had in years. I slept better. I stopped mentally calculating worst-case scenarios before making simple decisions. I even caught myself thinking that I had been overly afraid of commitment in the past, that this experience proved I could handle responsibility without it turning into a disaster. That confidence affected everything. I worked more efficiently, spoke more calmly, and stopped feeling like I was constantly bracing for impact. The strange thing is that this calm made me less observant. When a statement arrived that didn't fully make sense, I skimmed it instead of reading it closely. When an email referenced a clause or condition I didn't remember, I assumed it was just phrasing, not substance. I trusted the overall picture more than the individual details. Looking back, that trust wasn't blind. It was earned, day by day, by the absence of obvious trouble. Nothing went wrong quickly enough to trigger alarm. The anomalies were spaced out, diluted by weeks of normality. Then one afternoon, near the end of what I considered a particularly good month, I received a message that didn't fit neatly into the pattern. It wasn't aggressive or urgent. It didn't threaten anything. It was a simple notice attached to a routine invoice mentioning an upcoming adjustment tied to performance thresholds and minimums. The language was formal but calm, almost apologetic in tone.
I read it twice and realized I didn't fully understand what it meant or how it applied to me. Still, the amount listed wasn't enormous, and the payment date was weeks away. I told myself I'd look into it later, maybe over the weekend when I had more time. I filed it mentally under Things to Clarify and moved on with my day.
At the time, it felt like a minor administrative detail, the kind of thing that resolves itself once you ask the right question. I had no idea that this quiet, confusing message was the first clear sign that the ground beneath me wasn't as solid as it felt, only that something about it lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. I didn't sit down to read the contract because I was panicking. I did it because I wanted to understand that invoice. I told myself it would take 10 minutes, that I'd find a simple explanation and move on. I pulled the folder out of the drawer one evening after dinner, made another cup of coffee, and spread the pages across my table like I was doing something responsible, not desperate. At first, nothing jumped out. The language was dense but familiar. Paragraphs I remembered skimming, headings that felt reassuringly official. Then I found the attachment mentioned in that follow-up email, the schedule I had ignored. That's where things started to slow down. I read it once without really absorbing it, then again more carefully. What I understood, slowly and painfully, was this. I hadn't agreed to something flexible. I had agreed to something fixed. No matter how the business performed, no matter how many customers I had or didn't have, there was a minimum amount due every month. Not a target, not a projection, a requirement. If the numbers didn't reach that minimum, I was responsible for the difference. At first, I told myself I must be misreading it, so I kept going, line by line, translating it into plain thoughts. This isn't optional. This doesn't pause. This doesn't adjust. Then I reached the part about responsibility, the section that tied everything back to me personally. It didn't matter that the operation was set up as a business. If the business couldn't pay, I would. There was no clean exit either. Ending the arrangement early didn't mean it stopped. It meant penalties, fees, and continued obligations that followed the same fixed logic. I remember leaning back in my chair and staring at the ceiling, trying to fit this new understanding into the life I had been living for months. The calm didn't disappear all at once. It cracked. The next day, I called the contact I had dealt with from the beginning. I kept my voice even, explained that I was looking for clarification, that I wanted to make sure I understood how the minimums worked. He listened politely, and then said, without irritation or sympathy, that everything was outlined in the agreement. When I asked if there was flexibility, he paused just long enough to make me hopeful before saying, no, not really, that these terms were standard. That word again, standard. I followed up with emails, carefully written, respectful, asking if there were options, adjustments, any room to reconsider the structure. The replies came back measured and consistent. We understand your concern. Please refer to the signed agreement. You signed this. I requested a meeting, thinking that maybe face-to-face conversation would change something. It didn't. Sitting across from someone who had no emotional stake in my situation was strange. I explained how the numbers were tightening, how the market wasn't behaving the way projections suggested. He nodded, took notes, and then pointed to the same sections I had read the night before. Nothing he said was untrue. That made it worse. Each attempt ended the same way, with calm voices and closed doors. I wasn't being ignored. I was being answered, over and over with the same sentence, "You signed this." Over the following weeks, the stress didn't explode, it accumulated. Each statement reinforced the same reality. Each payment went through, and I felt it more sharply than the last. I adjusted spending again, cut back on anything unnecessary. convinced myself that if I just held things together, I could outlast the worst of it. I even looked into ending the operation early, thinking that stopping the bleeding might be painful but survivable. That's when the final piece fell into place. Ending it didn't mean freedom. It meant accelerating what I already owed, triggering costs that existed precisely to discourage leaving. I sat with that realization longer than I want to admit. The idea that there was no clean off-ramp, no moment where I could say, "This isn't working," and walk away. It felt heavier than the money itself. It meant that the decision I had made months earlier wasn't just a mistake, it was a commitment that didn't care how things turned out. That night, I put the papers back into the folder, but they didn't feel like documents anymore. They felt like a timeline, already set, moving forward whether I wanted it to or not. The hardest part wasn't understanding what I had missed, it was understanding that stopping wouldn't stop it. The loss didn't arrive as a single moment I could point to, it came in adjustments. I stopped eating out first, then canceled a streaming service I barely used, then switched to cheaper groceries without really thinking about it. Each change felt temporary, a sensible response to pressure that would ease once I found my footing again. I told myself this was what responsible people did when things tightened. At night, I opened spreadsheets and moved numbers around, convincing myself that discipline could solve anything. The payments kept going out on schedule, steady and indifferent, and my savings began to shrink in a way that was slow enough to ignore but fast enough to notice. I delayed replacing things that broke. I sold a camera I hadn't used in years, then a piece of furniture that suddenly felt unnecessary. None of it hurt individually. What hurt was the pattern forming without my permission. I stopped talking about the business altogether. When friends asked how things were going, I answered vaguely, said it was busy, said it was fine. Silence became easier than explaining something I didn't fully understand myself. There was a quiet shame in admitting that the careful person I'd always been had missed something so basic. I avoided phone calls that weren't work-related, not because anyone was pressuring me, but because conversation required a version of myself I no longer felt confident presenting. Even at work, I became more reserved, careful not to let stress bleed into my tone. I didn't want questions. The trap wasn't dramatic. No one yelled at me, no one threatened me. The system just kept working the way it was designed to. Every month reinforced the same reality. The obligation existed regardless of outcome. I tried to negotiate again, not emotionally this time, but practically. I gathered data, showed declining performance, proposed a modified structure that would at least slow the damage. The response was polite and final. Adjustments weren't possible without violating the agreement. That phrase, "without violating," echoed in my head. It meant that even if they wanted to help, they couldn't, or wouldn't. It didn't matter which. I explored transferring the operation to someone else, thinking that maybe another person could take it over and free me. But the requirements were strict, and the approval process moved slowly. By the time I found someone interested, the numbers no longer made sense for them. They walked away, and I didn't blame them. As the months passed, the business itself began to fade. Customers drifted off. Effort felt heavier because it no longer felt connected to hope. I was maintaining something I knew I couldn't save, but stopping felt worse. Each day I stayed operational bought me time, but it also drained me further. I cut back again, this time on things that mattered more. Travel disappeared from my calendar. I postponed plans I had quietly been looking forward to. My apartment grew emptier. Not physically at first, but emotionally. It felt like a place I passed through rather than lived in. The last attempt came quietly, without optimism. I asked if there was any hardship option, any temporary pause, any acknowledgement that continuing served no one. The answer arrived in the same measured tone as before. The agreement didn't allow for it. You signed this. By then, the words didn't sting. They felt flat, like a fact you stop reacting to once you've heard it enough times. Eventually, I made the decision to shut down the operation, not because it fixed anything, but because pretending it was alive required energy I didn't have left. I closed accounts, informed the remaining clients, and packed up what little there was to pack. The business ended without ceremony, without anyone noticing outside a small circle. What didn't end were the payments. They continued, now detached from any activity, like a shadow that remained after the body was gone. Sitting alone in my apartment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. I hadn't failed loudly or publicly. I had failed quietly, methodically, by honoring a commitment that no longer made sense but still existed. The business was over. The obligation wasn't. After the business ended, life didn't collapse. It narrowed. My days became simpler, slower, and smaller in ways I hadn't planned for but had to accept. I went to work, came home, ate the same meals, and slept without alarms on the weekends. The payments were still there, arriving on schedule like clockwork, and I built my life around them, the way you build furniture around a support beam you can't move. There were fewer choices now. I thought twice before agreeing to anything that involved money, time, or long-term commitment. Spontaneity disappeared, not because I didn't want it, but because it no longer felt safe. The apartment stayed quiet. I didn't replace what I had sold. I learned which expenses I could live without, and which ones I missed in a dull, constant way. Friends drifted slightly, not out of conflict, but out of mismatch. Their lives were expanding, mine was contracting, and neither of us knew how to talk about it without discomfort. I stopped offering updates. Silence became a form of stability. What surprised me most wasn't the financial loss, it was the erosion of confidence. I had always trusted my judgment, believed that careful thinking protected me from serious mistakes. That belief didn't survive. Every decision now came with a pause, a second guessing that felt permanent. Even small choices carried weight they didn't deserve. I replayed the signing day in my head more often than I wanted to admit, not with anger, but with disbelief. How easily I had convinced myself that nothing important could be hidden in plain sight. The sense of safety I used to feel in my own reasoning was gone. In its place was caution that bordered on fear, not loud or dramatic, but constant. Over time, the obligation began to shrink, not because it became lighter, but because I became used to carrying it. Months passed, then more. I adjusted again and again, until the reduced version of my life felt normal. There were moments of calm that felt earned, evenings where I read or walked without thinking about numbers. But the background awareness never fully left. It sat quietly, reminding me that my future had already been partially decided by something I no longer had control over. I didn't become bitter. There was no one to be angry at. The people I dealt with followed the rules. The system worked the way it was designed to. The responsibility rested where it always had. That understanding was heavy, but it was also clarifying. It forced me to stop framing my life as something that could be optimized and start seeing it as something that had limits. I learned to live inside those limits without pretending they didn't exist. When the final payment eventually approached, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a quiet release. Not relief, exactly, but space. Space to think without calculating. Space to consider possibilities without immediately dismissing them. Even then, I didn't rush to fill it. I moved slowly, carefully, aware of how easily momentum could become pressure again. Looking back, what that signature took from me wasn't just money or time. It took a version of myself that believed caution alone was enough. It replaced it with someone who understands that attention matters, that responsibility doesn't end with good intentions. I don't tell this story to warn anyone in a dramatic way. I tell it because it's easy to forget how small decisions can echo. The moment that changed everything wasn't the struggle or the loss or the end. It was a quiet afternoon, a stack of papers, in the assumption that the fine print didn't matter.